Well, joined today by Sam Freedman, the CEO of Education Partnership Groups. And Sam, you're going to talk to us a little bit about the work that Education Partnerships Groups is doing in Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved and what sort of things you're up to, and maybe how that's changed over the last year?
Sure. So my background is in education in the UK. I worked for think tanks, then the DFE when Michael Gove was there. Then I worked for Teach First for 5 years. I was an executive director there. But I always had this sort of interest in international education. And I've always felt that, for all the problems we've got in the UK, there is a universal access. There is a sort of a bar of quality that we look for and regulate against, and that most children get a reasonable quality of education, and a lot of children get a great quality of education. Whereas in most of the world, there are still large numbers of children not in school at all, and of those that are, a lot aren't learning anything. They're simply being warehoused in buildings during the day. But the learning quality is close to zero. And I always felt like there's just such huge room for improvement where your learning quality is essentially zero and your learning is essentially zero, that you could do far more in terms of raising standards in many countries around the world. So international education was really interested me, and then 2.5 years ago, this opportunity arose to take over Education Partnerships Group and to set a vision for it, and to start working outside the UK. And what we do primarily is we work with governments. We're a very government-focused organisation. Most international organisations or NGOs tend to work more directly in countries. We work only with governments. And we help them think about their systems. So we're very system focused, and we're very policy focused. So we're helping them try and redesign their education systems, think about different policy levers that they can and can't pull, and how to do that. We help them with research, policy design, piloting, implementation, and we're working currently in 5 countries, 4 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, mainly West Africa.
Right. So if I just then talk a little bit about what you said about that children in many parts of the world are learning practically nothing. How do we know that?
There's a lot of assessment data. So we have various kind of regional data collection exercises that are often done by international organizations or regional organizations. And we can see from that the learning quality is, and what young people know is extremely low. The sort of functional literacy rate is very low still. And if you look at, there's a something called PISA for development, which is kind of a PISA version of the PISA tests for countries that are less developed than global north countries, and the results are shockingly bad in many countries. You have you have 2 or 3% of children able to reach what would be considered a basic level in a sort of normal PISA study. So it's really clear that in many countries, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, in southern Asia as well, parts of Latin America, Central America, there is there's just a huge number of kids who are in a school building but essentially not learning anything while they're there.
So what are they doing? What sort of things are going on, would you say?
So a real mix. You will have schools where you have teachers who are doing their best, but they're not trained or not trained well. And the materials they have are sort of hopelessly out of date. They're operating against a curriculum that doesn't make a lot of sense. you'll get a lot of lessons where you've got huge class sizes
Yeah.
typically, 60 to 80 kids in a room, and a teacher reading a text that's just hopelessly out of date and meaningless to the young people in the room. You've also got huge language barriers. So a lot of the time you've got teaching going on in English or French or Spanish, and you've got young people who don't know the language. It's just going straight over their heads. Again, it's different in different countries. Obviously, you've got different contexts, but I would say most of the time you are getting some kind of teaching, but it's either meaningless because they don't understand the language, or meaningless because the content is well above any level that they could cope with, or just completely irrelevant. One school in Kenya I visited, they were doing business studies. This was a good school actually, which does have reasonably good learning rates. But they were doing business studies, and they were learning about CD-ROM drives, just because the book they had was 20 years out of date, 25 years out of date. So resources, curriculum, teacher training, language, there's so many issues that contribute to this kind of this huge challenge. And then at the sort of the worst end of the spectrum, you've got children whose teachers don't turn up, where the staff are very disengaged, and it's easy to be sort of to condemn that, but this is a context where teachers are often not paid, or where they're not paid for months at a time, or and often. So in Uganda, one of the countries we worked, you had a situation where a lot of teachers in the public schools, the state schools, also were working in private schools simply because they needed the money, and therefore, if you're doing two jobs, you can't be in two places at once. So you've got one set of children who aren't getting access to a teacher. So you've got kind of what you might call heavy pedagogical problems with the quality of education, and in some cases, a simple absence of education altogether.
Yeah. So this is definitely the narrative of education in sub-Saharan Africa that many people will be familiar with. And I visited some schools in Uganda last year, just before the pandemic in February, and the briefing I got was very much in tune with as you've described. And I have to say that obviously one's experiences are anecdotal and very partial, but I felt very impressed with a lot of the teaching that I saw. As you say, huge classes. I mean, in some cases, 60 to 80 kids in a room would be great if there were that few. I saw classes where there were 100 plus children in a room, and that I saw great teaching of phonics in children's mother tongue, and really good response from the students who were there, and a lot of perhaps the information about teacher absenteeism, and I know that sort of comes out strongly from World Bank reports, doesn't seem completely substantiated by what we find on the ground. And I wonder, is there an extent to which some of these problems are exaggerated, or do you think it really is as bleak as that? And I've just been very fortunate in what I've seen.
I mean, obviously, you've got great examples. There are schools I visited that are fantastic, and with far fewer resources that any school would have here, are doing an amazing job with really dedicated teachers, dedicated school leaders, and very well trained as well in some cases. So there are plenty of schools you can visit where you will see a high quality of education going on. I just don't think they're the norm.
Right.
They are rare examples, or too rare examples. They're also much more likely to be in cities, in the capital cities, and larger cities. There's a big rural-urban divide.
Yes.
In most sub-Saharan African countries, and rural education is much lower quality typically. So you also have very different balance between private and non-private and state in countries as well. So in Lagos, 80% of the schools in Lagos are private schools. and they are of widely differing quality, from very, very good elite kind of private schools to terrible kind of backstreet rooms. So you definitely do have examples of quality, and I think that's one of the most frustrating things about working in the sector is that nothing wrong with the kids, and it's perfectly possible to train teachers to a level where, even given the less resources, you can give kids an excellent education, but it's just not happening at scale, which is why I'm really interested in, my organization's really interested in policy and the state.
Right.
Ultimately, you can't get that scale without having a functioning system. And that's where so often you get the problems, is that there isn't accountability, there isn't regulation, there isn't resource flows. So you'll get brilliant examples, but you've not got the ability to scale that across the system.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the sorts of policies, the sorts of system changes that might be beneficial, what sorts of things, if you can sort of generalize at all, what sorts of things?
So I think that's a huge question.
Yes.
It covers pretty much all of what we do as an organization, but I think that typically you have highly centralized education systems in theory,
Yeah.
but where the levers aren't attached to very much. So you've got education ministries and agencies who do all of the policy and all of the kind of the thinking, but they are relatively detached from the local bodies, regional bodies that actually are supposed to implement the policies that they set out, and you have minimal, weak accountability relationships between the centre and the local, and weak chains of kind of feedback. So what's decided at the centre doesn't necessarily happen at the local level. I think you also have what we kind of what's called in the sector capability traps, where most of the money, most of the kind of discretionary funding available to governments comes from international agencies.
Yeah.
World Bank, USAID, FCDO in this country, and therefore there's a very strong incentive to do the things that those agencies want you to do to get the money to be able to do anything beyond just paying your teachers. And because well-meaning, all of these agencies want stuff to happen, you can end up with sort of a lot of different priorities happening. Yeah. Governments are trying to sort of take from all of these different pots of available funding, but without really the capacity or capability to make those policies work. So there's a lot of taking money from an agency, or doing some policy work, writing some nice reports, doing a nice kind of curriculum, and then nothing much happens with it because there isn't the money, the capacity to actually then all the accountability relationships with local government to make that happen. There's also a tendency, because of that, to perhaps see Global North as being an oasis of brilliant ideas about education, whereas actually we know that's not true. You get a lot of, Finland has a great curriculum, let's do what Finland are doing curriculum wise, and I don't think Finland do have a great curriculum, and I wouldn't recommend any country do it, but I certainly don't think that a country that has far fewer resources, a totally different context, in every conceivable way, should be trying to copy the Finnish curriculum or even thinking about what's going on in Finland. So there's a lot of kind of policy borrowing that really doesn't make sense.
No, I mean, and that sort of certainly sort of pans out with some of the things that I've seen for myself. That I went to visit a teacher training college in Kampala, and they were asking me sort of questions about how would you do group work in a class of 80, and I said I wouldn't. Anyone who suggests that you do that, make them show you, because I just don't think it's going to be possible.
Right.
What we need is really sensible, proportionate decisions about how to deal with the context that you're in, and not try to, as you say, borrow from other systems where the concerns and the constraints are completely different.
So one of our big focuses is being government led, because we think they know their country better than we do,
Yeah.
and context driven. So not coming along and saying, oh, you should do the British curriculum, or you should
Yeah.
you should recreate Ofsted exactly as it is. If you want to do some regulation, let's think about how it would make sense to do that in your context with your kind of ideas, rather than trying to replicate an organisation that wouldn't make any sense in that context.
Absolutely, and I think people probably watching may have very little understanding of some of the barriers. So, for instance, schools inspectors share transport, and they physically are going to find it very, very difficult to access the schools that they're meant to go and visit. And I remember
Yeah,
talking to some schools inspectors, and I said to them, "What's the one thing that would make a difference to you being able to do your job?" And they said, "A motorbike."
yeah, absolutely. We did. We developed the secondary and school inspection system for Uganda, and a huge part of that was fuel allowances,
Yeah.
which isn't an issue when for Ofsted inspectors, but it is a real issue, especially you're asking people to travel huge distances. So
On very, uncertain roads, especially in the rainy season.
you've got to take that kind of thing into account. You can't just try and replicate something that's happening in Europe.
And the infrastructure in terms of computers availability, there might be. I've certainly visited schools where they have computers, but certainly none of them are connected to the internet.
Yeah, I think I get quite frustrated by this sort of obsession. I get frustrated anyway with the obsession with ed tech everywhere. But you talk to a lot of governments, and they're being heavily sold ed tech solutions, and you're like, you don't have electricity in a lot of the villages
Yeah.
where the education quality is worst. You don't have internet access.
No.
Why are we talking about ed tech solutions when there are some really simple ways that we could get high quality literacy and numeracy teaching into these schools? That hasn't happened yet. Ed tech is something that happens once you've got the basics in place.
So, Sam, I know obviously with travel restrictions and everything else that's been in place since the start of the pandemic, clearly that's going to have affected the work that you're able to do. But how have you been carrying on? What sort of things are still going on, and what sort of successes are there amidst all of the difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very frustrating year for everybody, but anyone working in the international sector, not being able to travel is a huge problem, because how do you make good decisions about things when you can't see them directly? Luckily, we have teams in country. A big part of our model is to have local staff embedded in the ministry who are with us. And they've obviously been able to continue working throughout, and we've sort of moved that process even further, having more staff in country and fewer staff in London or elsewhere, as part of our response to that pandemic. But we've been able to keep going with most of our projects. Actually, I think most governments have reacted in different ways to COVID, and some have cancelled exams, some have even pushed back the whole school year, like in Kenya. But in terms of their kind of working, they're actually much more likely to still be in their office, still be working kind of face to face, using masks and so on. But the outbreak has been, for whatever reason, less severe, so or certainly less concerning to people than it has been here. So things have gone on a bit more normally than here, even though obviously it's had a big impact.
Yeah, of course. I think lots of people were sort of speculating that things, might go really badly in Africa, and actually, as you say, they seem to have done a lot better than we have in Europe.
There's lots of reasons why that might be true. Part of it might be just the data recording and when different countries record this data. But I also think much younger populations, and as we know, this is an illness that's very targeted at older people.
Yeah.
And you also have a lot more people who are outside most of the day. So,
True. True, and but I remember being struck when, as I say, when I visited Uganda in February, when we knew about COVID, and it was on the news. We weren't really sure what was going to happen. Arrived in Kampala Airport, and there were hand washing facilities everywhere. My temperature was taken. It was all very, very serious. And everywhere I went, I was expected to sanitize. Got back to Heathrow, nothing.
Yeah,
Nothing.
absolutely. Well, they're much more used to infectious diseases, right? So
Yeah.
they have a lot more protocols in place. Sierra Leone, where we work, had a horrendous Ebola outbreak not that long ago. So they just pulled a lot of their Ebola plans and responses out of the drawer, and they were doing the same thing, yeah, absolutely, at airports, at the ministry, sanitizing, etc. So so in many ways they were better set up than a country like the UK, where we've never really had anything like this, or not for a very long time anyway.
No. And the radio has played a big part in the way governments have tried to cope with children being off school, hasn't it? Do you know?
Yeah,
Have
yeah.
you been part of that?
There's been a few interesting attempts to use radio to kind of broadcast lessons, because obviously, as we were saying, a lot of young people don't have access to computers or the internet, so you can't sort of use that kind of technology. There's been a really interesting experiment in Sierra Leone with an organisation called Rising, who run some excellent schools in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and are just about to start in Ghana as well. They developed some lessons for broadcast, and I think it's being controlled trial tested as well. So I think we should get some really good evidence from that as to how well that's worked.
Yeah. So I've Steph Dabrowski. I've worked with her, who runs Rising in Sierra Leone. Wonderful person.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've been really impressed with looking at what they've been doing. But that brings us on, as you say there, that Rising operate really good quality, low cost private schools. And you touched on the problem in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where there are unregulated independent schools all over the place. And you've got people like, for instance, James Tooney, who sees the burgeoning of low cost private schools as a great thing, and it's the market sort of taking control of education. Where do you come down on the issue of in the private schooling in places like Africa?
So I think private schools have been a necessary part of growth over the last few years, simply because the state hasn't provided enough access for young people. And in a lot of countries we're talking about, there's been huge population growth, so just impossible to keep up with the rate of that growth. So private schools have had to come into existence to provide that kind of access. But there is a real spectrum of quality in those private schools, and there are a lot of extremely poorly run, or ones that are run simply for the profit of the founders, not for the interests of the children at all. So our view is that the private sector in sub-Saharan Africa is absolutely kind of a necessary part of providing access at the moment,
Right.
and will continue to be so for some time. But the aim should be to integrate it as much as possible with the state, which means that there is effective regulation of safety. You've got horrific stories of sexual abuse going on in schools. You absolutely need schools to be properly regulated for safety alone before you even get to education quality. But also, they should be looking at the quality of education that those children are getting as well, and using things like subsidies wisely to sort of win that permission to do that regulation. So, for instance, one of the things we're working on at the moment is in Cote d'Ivoire. They have a big secondary subsidy program because they wanted to provide more access to secondary schools. They didn't have the physical capacity to do that through state schools, so they provide a subsidy for young people who go to a private secondary school. But there's very little regulation as part of that program at the moment. very little controls over where that money is going. So we're helping them to devise some options for a better regulated, more targeted subsidy program to make the better use of those private schools. So that's where we are. You need it. There's no way of not having it at the moment, but let's make sure let's integrate it over time. And a long way into the future, it'd be great if we had fully integrated and fully state-run systems. It's just we're just not there yet.
So yeah, as I understand it, like an outfit like Rising sort of almost uses PFI because they're running some of the state schools, and they use some of the profit that they make from their low cost private schools to help put resources and training into the state schools as well. I mean, is that a model you think?
They have a kind of mixed model, exactly. So one of the things that Education Partnerships Group was involved in before I arrived actually was setting up a public-private partnership in Liberia, one of the first like it in sub-Saharan Africa, where the government subcontracted state primary schools to non-state providers to run, sort of like academies, but obviously in a very different context. And that has been that has been RCT'd, that program, and there are learning gains, not massive learning gains, but there are learning gains from the schools that were taken over versus the control group. But also, interestingly, there were very big differences between the different operators who participated in the program. Rising were the most successful and got fantastic results. Others did little better or even slightly worse than the normal state schools. So I think almost like the academies program, what it shows us is that doing these kinds of programs means you can bring in brilliant, innovative operators who add something new and can be a beacon to other providers, but you can also get crap.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a risk as well as potential reward.
If you don't regulate it right, the risk of crap increases.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there have certainly been some operators in Africa in particular who have given maybe the rest of the sector a really bad reputation, and probably won't go into any names, but there are a few big players who have made a lot of people very angry. I think it would be fair to say.
Yeah, and as ever, there's an argument about profit here as well. Rising are actually a for-profit organisation for various reasons, but they're fantastic. But there are other for-profit organisations who we won't go into name-wise, but who seem much more rapacious and definitely are creating a bad reputation for the sector.
Absolutely, and it's almost it's a continuation of this sort of age-old way in which Africa has been viewed by the rest of the world, perhaps, that something to be exploited, and
that's certainly and that's certainly the criticism you get, and with some justification in some cases.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam, for that insight into the work that your organisation is doing in Africa. I wonder if we can move now to talk to you a little bit about some of the comings and goings in here at home in Blighty, and so. Those you mentioned at the beginning that you at one stage in your career were a special advisor working under Michael Gove, and you've got some first-hand experience of Dominic Cummings, who's recently left his employment at Number 10. And can you tell us a little bit about the relationship of special advisors to ministers, and how that might have changed in recent years since your time, and how we might sort of view Dominic Cummings as a sort of exemplification of a particular sort of paradigm?
Sure. So just to be very clear, I was a senior policy advisor, not a SPAD.
Sorry.
Very important to me because it means I wasn't a political appointee. I was a civil servant. But I did work in the same office as the SPADs and worked closely with them. And my focus was on policy, which meant I didn't need to get involved in the kind of politics of briefing MPs or going to party conferences, thank God. But SPADs are very individual. Like they tend to match the minister's priorities and focus and personality type in a way, right? So you for someone like Michael Gove, who is I think an unusually dynamic, whatever you think of his policies and ideas, he's an unusually dynamic minister in terms of getting stuff done and wanting to push forward an agenda. He would go for people like Dominic, who, eccentric as he is certainly highly motivated to get stuff done. But it's quite unusual, I think. Ministers, you've got a lot of ministers who aren't, who are quite keep their heads down and just build their careers, and they'll often have SPADs who are, not particularly seeking the limelight, just happy to get on with it and build their career. So Dominic is certainly not a typical SPAD
Okay.
at all. I mean, you have really kind of three types of SPADs. You have policy nerds. Had I been a SPAD, that would have been the type I was, who are just very focused on working between the civil service and the ministers to try and get a sensible policy agenda that broadly fits with what the minister wants and what the manifesto committed to. You've got press SPADs who spend all their time on the phone to the media. So we had a guy called Henry Dezout, who I think is actually now non-exec for the DfE, but he was kind of the media SPAD. So he was just always on the phone to journalists. That was his whole job. And then you have kind of chief of staff type SPADs who do a bit of both, but are also kind of more like the senior SPAD and responsible for the kind of overall direction more of the minister's interests. So Dominic was I think technically in that kind of role, but did it in a very different way to most people. Someone like Luke Trill, who played that role for Nicky Morgan, I think did it he was very good and did it in a more kind of conventional chief of staff way, where he'd be the person you'd go to if you the gatekeeper essentially for her, and would have his eyes over all of the kind of communications and policy side of things. But it's very, very different depending on the minister, and they're only usually a minister will have two or three SPADs. So it's compared to the civil service of 3,000, 4,000 people. It's in any department. It's you've got fairly small numbers in that team.
So a fictional program like Armando Iannucci's The Thick of It, does that bear any resemblance to what goes on behind the scenes in government?
Yes, I think so. I mean, what The Thick of It captures really well is the fact that the sort of chaos of it all, the fact that you're constantly being reactive to stuff that's going on, and it's only the very strongest ministers who are able to be proactive and have a clear agenda that they take forward, even when all the kind of shit is going off all around them. And I think the kind of quiet bat people episode, that sort of sense of just kind of people desperately trying to figure out how to react to circumstances definitely feels true. But I thankfully never met anyone quite like Malcolm Tucker.
Okay, right. So he is a creation.
Based on Alistair Campbell, who I obviously never worked with, but I'm not sure Alistair Campbell was quite that aggressive.
Right. So, let's. So obviously, I say obviously, but Dominic Cummings, sometimes credited by some people as masterminding the Brexit campaign, comes to the attention of Boris Johnson, becomes his special advisor. Enormous amounts of political capital expended over the summer dealing with the visit to Durham and all of that, and lots of anger, lots of upset. Dominic survives, and then a few months later, he's left number 10. What do you think the story is there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I have not been in touch with any of the people involved, so I have no inside track here. But my guess, and we'll find this out as the books are written over the coming years, is that Boris was intimidated by Dominic Cummings. He's an extremely intimidating person, and Boris is not someone who's known for standing up to people particularly. And one of the details that did come out was that Boris Johnson asked Dominic Cummings to apologise over the Barnard Castle incident, and Dominic just refused. Now, in any other number 10 I can think of, that would have led to someone being fired straight away. But I honestly think that Boris Johnson was just scared of him, and didn't want to upset him and create kind of those ructions. So let him handle the response, which was then hopeless in terms of the public response, and I think genuinely led to the wider public being less interested in following regulation.
Yeah.
As a result. So and then he's left on his own terms, not because he's been fired.
Right. Is that what? So we think that would have been his decision?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think Boris Johnson made a decision about he didn't want this Lee Kane chap to be his chief of staff after heavy lobbying from his partner and many MPs. And Dominic said, "Well, then you don't get me either," and quit.
The box, right? Okay. Interesting insight. So maybe Boris Johnson's scared of Dominic Cummings. As you say, we'll find out as the biographies are written. Sam, can I ask you before I let you go? The big pressing concern at the moment is on whether or not exams are going to go ahead in England. So decisions have been made in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in England, government have committed to exams going ahead. There's various speculation about what form they will go ahead in. But also, I think if we've learned anything over the last few months, it's that we can't really trust, perhaps, the government to, if they've committed to a decision, we can't trust that they won't completely U-turn on it later. So what can you sort of frame the problem for us in terms of, what are the alternatives? What are some of the best things that are on offer? And is there any hope for school students this year who are waiting to find out what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrible situation. There's no good, as there wasn't this summer, there's no good answer here. You've got a situation where the current sort of year groups that are going to be taking exams in the summer have not only lost a large chunk of their education, but have lost it differentially.
Yeah.
So, and region, different in different kind of regions, different in different school. In every school, some kids have had to be off for large chunks of time. Others have since lockdown ended have been able to be in school the whole time. So you've got lost learning and differential lost learning. So when you get to the summer and you need to somehow triage young people into their next destination, whether it's kind of sixth forms, further education colleges at 16, or university apprenticeships, other kinds of courses at 18. You have to use something to make that decision. You can use a kind of slightly toned down version of the exams. You can use teacher assessment of some kind, moderated to different levels, or you could use you could simply use the destinations. They could make decisions about who they take.
Yeah,
these are really your options. But none of them are good, because all of them will be affected by differential learning loss. And the teacher assessment has the added flaw of creating kind of massive disparity between different schools, because teachers, through no fault of their own, simply are unable to, at the individual level, create a system that is equal in every school, because they don't know how other teachers are behaving in their school.
right.
So I think when people criticize teacher assessment, it's often seen as you don't trust teachers. I trust teachers, and they make good judgments about their own students. I just don't think those judgments will be the same in every classroom, in every school. They'll be using their own slightly different way of making those decisions. It's not like I think they're cheating. I just don't think it's possible for a 500,000 people to simultaneously come up with results that fit a fair system. So I think the argument for keeping exams is that yes, it's going to be more unfair than ever this year, but it's still better than any other alternative in that at least you will get a fair assessment of where everybody is, and you will those who do achieve will get proper certification. Whereas if you go for a kind of teacher assessment model, you just add even more complexity and confusion into the system, and people don't leave with certification either. But for me, the crucial aspect of it is the destination, because that's what really matters. That's what we saw this summer. It's where you're going. Like, do you get into the university of your choice? Do you get onto the apprenticeship of your choice? So I would be working with the universities, with the apprenticeship providers, with the FE colleges and sixth forms to make sure you had as many places available as possible, so that you could be maximally generous in destinations to try and deal with the unfairness that's been created by learning loss. It's still going to be unfair on some young people. There's just no way of avoiding it, I don't think.
Absolutely. So, in terms of focus then on destinations, there's an argument where if schools and whether sixth forms are focused on these exams, and the main use of these exams is to determine where children go next, would it be more rational, more sensible for universities, apprenticeships, apprenticeship providers to actually do that sorting process themselves? Is this a good use of education anyway, despite, even if we weren't talking about the unfairness caused by differential learning loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things this summer's crisis really showed up was how ridiculous our university access system actually is compared to other countries who obviously had COVID but didn't have this level of crisis over this process of university access. The fact that in any year, regardless of COVID, 1 mark's difference can be the difference between you going to what's considered to be one of the most elite universities or not is a bit daft. And the sheer level of hierarchy within our university structure lends itself towards that. There's an obsession with Oxford and Cambridge, which have sort of 6,000 places a year between them, which that's always going to be very limited. Then you've got kind of an obsession with the Russell Group and so on as you work your way down. I think it does. Once this is all over, I think it opens up some broader questions around why we feel the need to select so tightly at university. If you look at a country like Canada, they don't even really do an equivalent to A levels. But they don't need to, because anyone who wants to go to university kind of does, and they're all pretty much considered to be of similar quality. So there's not this kind of desperate need to get that grade higher to get into the very top place, so that you then get access to the best jobs and so on. So I think it does kind of open up some much broader questions about systematic fairness. That even in a good year when everything's run smoothly, there's a lot of inaccuracy in especially on the humanities side in A-level marking.
Yes.
So when you're saying these tiny differences make such huge difference to people's lives, and yet you've got inaccuracy built into the system, and of course the unfairness of the school system where rich parents can tutor their kids or send them to private schools. I think we need to look at how selective our tertiary system is and whether it needs to be that selective.
So a lot of people have taken the opportunity now to call for a rethink on the whole way we do summative assessment in schools and colleges. Is it time to rethink the system? Are there any better alternatives to exams that are out there that other places in the world are using and we're just not seeing?
I think most countries have some kind of examination between junior and upper secondary. That could be anywhere between 14 and 16, depending on the country. We are unusual in how important those exams are,
Right.
in our system, partly because we use them to judge the schools to a very tight regulatory process. And Ofsted use them heavily, obviously. So schools feel very compelled to put a lot of energy into them.
Mm.
But most countries do something at that age, and I think it's reasonable to do some kind of examination at that age, because a lot of children, when they go into upper secondary, will not be doing academic subjects. Only 40% of kids do A levels. So for the 60% of young people who are going to do a vocational course after 16, I think it's really important they've got some kind of academic certification. The degree of importance we put on it in our system, and the focus we put on it, and how it drives the curriculum all the way down to 11, I think you can look again at that. I think that's a lot of that's in how we use the results, not necessarily in having exams themselves.
Okay, so that's an interesting point, Sam. So you say 40% of children go on to do A levels, and those that do other courses need some kind of academic certification. But many of them aren't going to be, or the only academic certification they're going to be getting is that they didn't do very well?
Well, I'm not sure that's necessarily true. A lot of people who go on to do BTECs and apprenticeships will have done quite well at GCSE, and will certainly have got C grades, which is important as a marker for employers.
Yeah.
So I do think it really matters that you have some kind of academic certification at that age, because I think if you don't, you will have you end up having to do it in the vocational course, essentially.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I think were wrong with the structure of diplomas, which are not. I don't completely disagree with the idea of diplomas in principle, but one of the structural problems was that these vocational courses were actually really pseudo-academic, because you needed to certify the academic quality through them. So you end up muddling the two things together. So I would rather we certificated academic at 16, and then for those who weren't going to carry on in an academic path, they were able to do proper vocational courses that led to employment after that.
Yeah, but I think, doesn't it? I'm not sure of the statistic off the top of my head. You might know this better than me, but isn't it around 40% of the cohort don't get a grade 4, and therefore we're certificating that percentage, whatever it is, have not met a standard, and it's.
Yeah. I think that might be the number for who don't get either English or maths.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think more get one or the other.
Okay. I think that's right.
But I think even if what you get is a 3, or it's still better than not having anything to take to an employer. So I think I do think it matters. But I'm very open to discussing like how those exams work, how we use the data, like how many subjects you do them in. I think I'm not sort of saying GCSEs are the perfect system. I don't think they are, but I think it's a bit naive to say, oh, we don't need exams at 16 because people are still in education till 18. They are, but they're doing very different types of education.
Would it be practical? I mean, so in your view, your knowledge of the system, do you think it would be practical to have something along the lines of a driving test model where you can retake as often as need be until you pass? Obviously, with driving tests, we assume that pretty much everybody is going to be able to pass eventually, and then they're certified to be roadworthy. Is there scope for a similar sort of model in terms of basic literacy and numeracy in schools, do you think, or is that?
You kind of have that in the sense that if you don't get the 4, you're supposed to redo it in the 6th form. I mean, there isn't a high success rate.
No.
But that does make me wonder whether an even more driving test kind of process would be feasible, in the sense that if we consider level 4 to be what the right standard for literacy and numeracy for adult life, then there may just be a large group of people at the moment who are not getting the teaching and support required to get them over that line. So I'd be more inclined to think about what do we need to be doing further back in the system to make sure that everyone does get a 4. My view has always been that it should be possible for anyone who doesn't have serious learning difficulties to get a 4. I've not seen any kind of data or cognitive kind of analysis that suggests that that isn't possible, and there are fully comprehensive schools that get nearly every child to a 4. So I believe that must be possible at a national level if we get the education system right.
So the large percentage of children who don't get 4s in maths and English, is that an indictment of the system then?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an indictment of the system. I don't think it's easy to do what I'm talking about. I just think it's possible, and that should be our aim as a system. And that does mean, by the way, some tweaks to the way GCSEs are. I think it needs to be easier to show improvement year on year in the system through GCSEs. Comparable outcomes makes it very difficult for there to be a higher percentage of 4s year on year.
Yeah,
we're talking normal world, not the moment where the whole thing is in a mess. So I acknowledge that you need to move to a slightly more kind of criterion reference model if you're going to do what I'm talking about. But I do think that we should be aiming for a system where 95% of kids get what we consider to be an adequate level of literacy and numeracy by the time they leave the first stage of secondary school.
Yeah, and we're nowhere near that, are we?
And we're nowhere near that at the moment, but some schools do it, right? So it is possible. You've got completely comprehensive schools with a very wide ability range on entry that are getting 95% plus 4s.
Yeah, absolutely, and they are an inspiration, and there are various schools that I know of and I've worked with, and I just think what they're doing is incredible. But with the current system, it wouldn't be true to say that if everybody did what they're doing, that we could then get 95% of people getting a level 4, because the grade boundaries would just rise.
I mean, in theory, if the exam boards can show a genuine improvement in quality, they can award more 4s than the previous years. But it's pretty hard to do that at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying I think you need to loosen that up as well if you were going to set that ambition. And right now, if a politician said we want 95% of kids to reach this benchmark, a lot of teachers would rightly say, but the system works completely against that ambition because of comparable outcomes. So I think you'd need to look at that again. But I think that would be the right ambition. I don't see how we can continue to think it's acceptable that we're whether it's 30 or 40% of kids are failing at that age. So you would need to tweak the system, but I think you'd also need to do a lot of things differently educationally.
Right. So don't get rid of exams, but exam reform probably necessary if we're serious about getting what we say we want.
And be really clear about your objectives, right? I mean, this is one of the problems with exams. They're trying to achieve so many different things. We're using them to regulate the school. We're using them to certificate individuals for their employment, but also using them as a sorting mechanism for where they go to next. I think we need to be really clear about what we're trying to achieve with a possibly simpler, cut down set of exams, which for me is certification is the primary goal.
So would you be arguing then that using them to hold schools to account distorts the system?
Yeah, it does. But again, I mean, I think there's ways of using data to hold schools to account that would be less distorting. It's just that we have such a punitive model of accountability now, and schools are terrified of getting bad results for 1 year that it is distorting. I think there's a balance to be found where you have an accountability system that is initially focused on support and improvement and only goes to punitive after a lot of other options have been tried, which would still be a little bit distorting because accountability just is distorting. There's no way around it, but would be much less distorting than what we have at the moment.
Sam, thank you so much for wasting so much of your time talking to me this morning. It's been a real pleasure.
No worries.
It was great. Really enjoyed it.
Good to speak to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Bye.